Recording. So we've invited Professor Jacob Sherkow. He is a professor of law at the College of Law and also affiliated with the Institute for Genomic Biology, IGB, at the University of Illinois. He just came here just about 3 months ago, and he was at Harvard before that. So Jacob is a leading expert on IP protection for genome editing technology, including technologies like CRISPR, which have kind of really driven research in agriculture and bioengineering overall. He's the author of over 40 articles published in both scientific journals and traditional law reviews, including some really high-profile articles in Science, Nature, the Yale Law Journal, and the Stanford Law Review. Since 2018, he's been also a permanent visiting professor at the Center for Advanced Studies in Biomedical Innovation Lab, CBIL, at the University of Copenhagen Faculty of Law. So Jacob's work has been recognized by both the scientific and legal communities, and that's very interesting. And that's one of the big reasons we wanted to invite Jacob, is that this intersection between science and law, because we make all of this technology, all of this science as engineers and scientists, but eventually it has to become brought to the public, and a part of that process is what the legal implications are. So without further ado, I would love for Jacob to start his talk, and we can get started.
Yeah. Well, Girish, thank you so much for having me. Thank you, everybody, for spending a Friday lunch hour hearing me talk about patents of all things on the face of the earth, which I know is something that either some of you are unfamiliar with and perhaps some of you do not want to be familiar with, but still I think is somewhat important for understanding how technologies get translated from the research lab out either into the clinic if we're talking about human therapies, or into the field if we're talking about agriculture, right? So I'm gonna speak, I think, for the roughly 35 minutes or so, and then happy to round out the hour with questions. And Frida, given the open format of the seminar, I'm more than happy to take questions for things I'm actually presenting on, or kind of anything as a related topic. I think, as Professor Chowdhury was saying before, the purpose of the seminar is to, kind of open your mind in an interdisciplinary way. And so to the best that I can help with that, I would be more than happy to. All right, so let's talk about intellectual property for genome editing, and let's just talk about some differences between human therapeutics, which is primarily my field, and agriculture, which I think is at least a distant second for me, but probably near and dear to many of your hearts, right? Trying to cycle through slides. There we go. I see how this works. Okay, so there are many genome editing technologies out there that I think at least some of which many of you should be basically familiar with. There's the kind of darling of genome editing technologies. This is CRISPR. This is the system that is effectuated essentially only with a CRISPR-based nuclease, such as Cas9, which is probably the canonical nuclease, and a guide RNA that makes double-stranded breaks in the genome, has tremendous applications both on the eukaryotic and on the prokaryotic side, and both for human therapies and for agriculture as well. There are a number of other genome editing technologies, though, as well, right? CRISPR is not the first and not the only one out there. We have our zinc finger nuclease. Technologies. These are multiple nucleases that are linked together, that are able to provide a specific sequence match to get that double-stranded or overhang cliff break anywhere that you would like in the genome. There's the TALENs, right? These are the transcriptor activator like effector nucleases, right? Somewhat similar to ZFNs, right? Except they recognize a certain code, right? Depending upon which TALENs you end up matching. Way prior to that, I think kind of like somewhat now in the dustbin of history, were meganucleases. These are nucleases that were just huge enzymes, each one of which was specific to a certain multiple nucleotide sequence in a larger eukaryotic genome, such that you could be relatively confident that the sequence cleavage was somewhat unique to the genome, even if it was many billions of base pairs long. They weren't readily engineerable, and so they weren't things that were used all that often. But when they first came out, they evinced some serious interest from a number of companies. And then it's also, I think, really important to mention that when we're talking about the nucleases, we also talk about vectors, right? None of this stuff is going to work if we can't actually get it inside a cell, right? And even more specifically, right, if we're talking about eukaryotic cells, none of this is going to work if we can't get this not just inside the cytoplasm, but inside the nucleoplasm, right? And so finding particular vectors that work with the genome editing technologies that we have, these are all incredibly important, right? With that being said, right, all of these technologies are subject to some IP disputes out there. That is, that there are institutions or universities who are filing for patent protections, mainly patent protection, on these technologies, and there is some dispute as to who the proper owner for these technologies are, whether the patents that govern or that read on the particular technology are too broad relative to what the inventor has invented, or whether they're just narrow enough, and what rights the patent holder has to stop others from copying the technology, right? So one thing to think about when you're thinking about genome editing technologies, especially when you're thinking about those with respect to industrial applications, is that it's not simply a matter of just kind of like picking and choosing off the shelf which technology you think is best for your experiment, again, especially if we're talking about industrial applications here, but that uptake in the real world turns on some of the IP landscape for some of these technologies. That is, uptake turns on just how free or how easy or how inexpensive it is to license these technologies from patent holders that we have out there, right? So I think it makes sense at this point, because I know, or at least I would have to assume, that there's nobody from the College of Law on this talk. I think it makes sense to take a step back and just talk about generally exactly what patents are. Patents are a right to exclude. And this is something that I think is counterintuitive to many scientists. They're not a right to practice your own invention. You have that right, whether or not the government tells you otherwise. Rather, what the patent is that it's a right to prevent others from copying your invention if you have a valid issued patent covering your technology. Now, mind you, if you have a particular technology that you're using and somebody else has a patent on it out there, they may have a right to prevent you as well. So one way of thinking about this is that what patents are, at best, is that they're fences to keep others from off your property. That's a gross simplification, and property professors, including myself, would cringe at it, but that's a good way of thinking about it. What else are patents? Well, one of the reasons we have patents in the first place is that they're an incentive to invent. They're an incentive to invent because this right to exclude, this right to prevent others from copying your technology, allows a patent holder to set what economists would call supra-competitive prices for that particular piece of technology. That is, in a true world where there's market competition, right? There's market competition for a particular good. Generally speaking, if there's enough competition, the price is relatively about what we call marginal cost. That is, the cost it is to produce one particular unit of that item. Let's just take tube socks, for example. I think this is like a great example of what a competitive market looks like, right? Nobody is out there suing each other for patent infringement in the tube sock market. You go on Amazon, you can go to Walgreens, you go anywhere you want to buy tube socks. And the cost of tube socks is essentially what it costs to make them. There's the cost to purchase tube socks really isn't that much more than the cost it is to manufacture them. Those are competitive prices, all right? But if we have a patent covering a particular aspect of our technology, and if we have the ability to prevent others from copying our technology, we can set the price way above whatever that marginal cost is. This is super competitive prices. And the incentive to be able to set super competitive prices is essentially the incentive to invent something to get a patent on it. Patents are also used as an asset in the technology transfer process. That is, if you're doing federally funded research, here, University of Illinois, for example, there's a law called the Bayh-Dole Act that allows you to file for a patent application even though you've received essentially federal money to create and invent the particular technology that you did. This law has been around for 40 years. This is actually the 40th anniversary of the Bayh-Dole Act. And it's essentially the thing that spurred the technology, the professionalization of university technology transfer across the United States. The other thing the Bayh-Dole Act does, a little bit less well known, is it doesn't simply allow you, the researcher, to file for patents, but what it really does is it allows you and your institution to negotiate an agreement as to essentially how any royalties from that patent are going to be split. So many of you probably signed or otherwise subject to University of Illinois' OTM procedure. This is the Office of Technology Management, that says that if you get a patent and if you get royalty from that particular patent, 40% go to the inventors, after overhead, of course. 40% go to the inventors, 40% goes to the institution as a whole, and 20% goes to your department. This is one of the reasons why some departments are so keen on their faculty to be filing for patents on things that they invent. At the same time, this piece of paper that you get that's a patent, it's not self-enforceable. That is, you can't just, now that you have a patent, right, it's not like everyone's necessarily going to listen to you, right? You have to go out there and police your own patent. You have to go out there and ensure that others are not going to copy your particular invention. Generally speaking, the only way of doing this is either to have a lawyer write someone who seems to be copying your invention, let's call it a nasty gram, right? It's one of these lawyers' letters that says, we have a patent, please cease and desist what you are doing, or barring that, to actually sue somebody in federal court here in the United States, right? So, like I mentioned earlier, there's a bunch of IP covering a lot of these genome editing technologies, and I think it makes sense just to briefly walk through some of these, right? Let's start off with CRISPR, right? Maybe the canonical version of CRISPR uses one particular nuclease, right, Cas9, and if you want to be even more specific than that, it uses two essentially orthologs of this nuclease, one from Streptococcus pyogenes, the other from Staphylococcus aureus, right? And essentially, it's the University of California and the Broad Institute, which is in Cambridge, that have essentially been fighting over patent ownership for this particular technology. They're not keeping the patents only to themselves. They are sub-licensing it out to others. And at least in the agricultural space, the Broad's patents and some of the UC's patents, and if you're curious, I could talk about the mechanics in the Q&A, have been sub-licensed out both to DuPont Pioneer and to Corteva for industrial applications. On top of that, it's not like the Broad Institute and University of California are the only patent holders when it comes to CRISPR. There are, in fact, hundreds of patents from various institutions around the world. And in the literature, there's a bunch of what patent scholars call landscape analyses to determine exactly who owns these particular patents. Besides CRISPR, there are zinc finger nucleases, or ZFNs, and somewhat in contrast to the CRISPR patents, there's essentially one company that dominates the patent space for ZFNs. This company is called Sangamo, and they essentially have a patent fortress for how this came about in the first instance, right? The patent fortress are essentially in-licensed, that is, Sangamo licensed in a bunch of patents from a number of academic institutions, namely Johns Hopkins University, the Medical Research Council in the United Kingdom, and Caltech. There are also TALENs. TALENs have a somewhat of a long and interesting history in the academic space. I'll abbreviate it here by just saying that really it's this spin-out of a spin-out. It's Catalyxt, which is a subsidiary of Selectus, a company that you may have heard of, that essentially is doing its best to use TALENs for agricultural purposes and is responsible for IP licensing in this space. There's also a really interesting nonprofit organization that both provides funding and also tries to invest in industrial agricultural startups using TALENs. This organization is called Two Blades, right? Essentially, it's a take on exactly how TALENs work. Essentially, that they are two blades on opposite sides of the nucleotides that we have. Going back a little bit further in time to the early 2000s, we have our meganucleases. And the meganucleases were part of a pretty significant patent dispute between Precision Biosciences and Duke University on one side and Selectus on the other side. This dispute was settled in 2004/2005. Happy to talk about this again more in the Q&A, but like I said earlier, it seems like meganucleases have been relegated to the dustbin of history. So if anyone is curious, happy to talk about how that dispute arose and exactly what that means now. On top of that, vectors, again, really important. None of this stuff works. We can't get the machinery inside a cell. There are dozens and dozens of companies that hold patents covering vectors, and these patents and the vectors themselves operate in many, many different forms, right? There are big differences when we're talking about human therapies versus agriculture, right? And essentially a lot of those differences come down to maybe these four axes, right? Value, ownership, licensing, and forms of competition. On the value side, one of the main differences between the agricultural and the therapeutics market is that the value of a particular patent estate may be the difference for a human therapy between it going to market and it not. That is, if the patents are kicked out of the process, we may not bother bringing our particular product through clinical trials. This seems to be less the case in the agricultural space. On the ownership side, and the therapeutic side, many of the patents have their origins in basic university research. This is not universally the case in the agricultural side. A lot of patents covering basic pieces of technology are actually in the hands of industry. When it comes to licensing, one of the forms we want to think about is exactly how exclusive the licensing is, right? In other words, am I going to license to only one other company? Or am I going to license to a variety of companies? This is exclusive versus non-exclusive. On the human therapy side, most of the licensing that's done tends to be exclusive. And on the agricultural side, there's a lot of non-exclusive licensing that happens. On top of that, the form of competition that plays out is also incredibly important. And I'll talk a little bit about about different forms of competition when we talk about franchising in the human therapy space, right? When we're talking about human therapeutics and intellectual property, there's a number of reasons why IP is so important in the human therapeutic space. First, industry is responsible for much of the translational work, right? This is somewhat different from what happens in agriculture. There's actually a lot of stuff that happens in the field that starts here on campus. Technology transfer in the human therapy space is very expensive, and I'll discuss this a little bit more in a moment, right? Regulatory approval is needed. That is, like, you have to go through clinical trials. This probably comes as obvious, but that actually makes a big difference in the human therapy versus agriculture space. That if you have a new drug or a new vaccine, right, you have to get FDA approval to do that. Not necessarily the case in the agriculture space. APHIS has essentially discounted a lot of the approval framework for many different types of genome editing technology that we could be doing in the agricultural space now. In the human therapy space, the market is uncertain. That is, even if we have a particular drug, we don't know whether it's going to be a success or not, right? It could be a blockbuster, it could be a failure. And again, this issue about franchise competition, right? Franchise competition in the human therapy space is fierce. That is, it's not enough that you have a good product. You want to be the only franchise in your particular area, right? You want to be the only drug in your class. And the difference between being the only drug in your class or having other competitors out there may be the difference between success and failure. How does this connect with intellectual property? Well, kind of like this, right? Because industry is responsible for much translational work when it comes to human therapies, you have patents that are essentially sought for work all throughout the development pipeline, from very, very early stage stuff all the way up until late stage work that deals with the final end product that gets delivered to the market. With respect to technology transfer being very expensive, this means that there's a lot of university IP out there. There's a lot of university IP out there, so that when technology transfer happens, there's an asset as opposed to just a material that one is able to transfer to the commercial partner. Also, the startup value of companies when it comes to the human therapy space also turns a lot on patents and the thinking, and this is sometimes fuzzy thinking, I have to admit, but the thinking is that, well, if you got a lot of patents in the space, then you clearly have FTO, you have freedom to operate. We can talk a little bit more about in the Q&A how this really isn't true. Remember, one of the things I said earlier is that a patent's like a fence, right? And so someone may actually be able to keep you off of some of their property if it looks like your invention is encroaching on theirs, but still, this is at least the way that a lot of the thinking works, right? Because regulatory approval is needed, because clinical trials are expensive, right? Patents serve as an asset for that. That is, if you go through clinical trials and they fail, at the end of the day, it's not just money down the drain. You still have an asset in hand afterwards. You have this particular patent that you otherwise have licensed. And because a market is uncertain, right? When you have a market for a human therapy and it's not certain whether or not it's going to be a blockbuster, it's going to be a failure, at least the thing that patent gets you to do is to set super competitive pricing, right? You don't have to worry about getting to market and then having a whole bunch of competition pile on and having to sell your product for cheap. Suffice it to say, that's not the way that drugs work, at least here in the United States, right? Drug prices in the United States tend to be pretty high, right? And one of the reasons for this, among many other reasons, tends to be patents, right? Lastly, when it comes to franchise competition, right? Franchise competition is particularly fierce. So this means the disputes are worth it, right? Because exclusivity, franchise exclusivity, can be worth hundreds of millions of dollars, it's worth having patents and paying lawyers to enforce them, because that's just like a rounding error relative to how much a franchise is actually worth. Couple of, maybe famous human therapy genome editing patent disputes out there. There's the CRISPR-Cas9 patent dispute, which I think, we got 38 people on this call. I feel like at least one of you must have heard about at the very least, right? We just went through a second round of an interference proceeding at the Patent and Trademark Office. Each side has spent tens of millions of dollars on lawyers. And the second interference decision actually just came out today, like 4 hours ago. I had a delightful morning reading it and also tweeting about it. But if anyone wants to ask me questions about the second interference during the Q&A, I would be more than happy to answer those. There's another genome editing-ish. We can talk about the ish. There's another genome editing-ish patent dispute out there, and this is for a particular human therapy called CAR-T. This is chimeric antigen receptor T cell. It's extremely beneficial for a number of blood cancers out there. And there's a patent dispute focusing on exactly who has the proper ownership to these patents or not. A second appeal at the US Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit was just recently filed, and that's making its way through the system now. In addition, there's been some pushback against Sangamo for its patent estate over zinc-fingered nucleases. These are pretty tightly controlled. Sangamo is not great about licensing this to other commercial enterprises. They've been decent about licensing it to other academic institutions, but still, this to the extent that there actually is a genome editing product out there that comes from ZFNs, and there's actually there's actually at least one undergoing clinical trials right now. I certainly expect there to be a patent dispute over ZFNs in the future. What are some of the solutions to some of these hangups in the human therapy space? Well, you could go with patent pools, right? That is like all the people who own patents pool their patents together and then license them out to each other afterwards, right? But the problem with pools is that they're generally non-exclusive, right? In other words, if you're going to license them out to everybody, not one person has a right to do one thing. And so because pools are generally non-exclusive, pools have been thought of as a poor solution in the human therapy space for this kind of the patent friction that we have. There's at least been one proposed. For CRISPR, there have been absolutely zero particular details since it was first announced, and it doesn't seem like anyone has actually decided to run with it because it's entirely voluntary. It looks like pools, at least for CRISPR and genome editing, not likely to happen. All right, you could have a clearinghouse model, right? You take a bunch of patents, you put them in the hands of a third party, and the third party gets to determine who gets what, right? And it's essentially a clearinghouse model. The problem there is that if you got some good patents, you don't want to lose control over, right? You don't really care whether someone else has like lesser valuable patents. If you got the good stuff, why would you entrust that to a third party? Nobody wants to give up control. So the clearinghouse model, at least in the human therapy space, has also proved not super attractive for IP when it comes to genome editing technologies, right? All right, you could take all the big players in the field and you could just consolidate, right? You just have essentially a duopoly or an oligopoly when it comes to patents, but no one's implemented that just yet. Notably, right, the UC and the Broad Institute, they essentially had an opportunity to be a duopoly and have decided not to do that for reasons that I personally find to be perplexing, right? I would, if you were to tell me, right, you know, you have a 50% chance of being a monopoly, but 100% chance of being a duopoly, I would pick the duopoly. But that's just me. This is not what the parties have done in the CRISPR context. And you could also do sublicenses, right? In other words, like if you're not going to use all the patent scope that you have, you sublicense it to a bunch of other commercial players out there, but then this leads to direct competition. Right? In other words, you're essentially competing with the same people you're sublicensing to. And again, because franchises are super important for human therapies, this doesn't really happen that often. So let's contrast this with what's going on for agriculture intellectual property for genome editing technologies, right? So unlike human therapies, right, both academia and industry tend to pair together to do a lot of what people call translational work. Right? It is not just Corteva or right the University of Illinois that's doing something in the field. It's often a pairing of these. It's often a pairing of these companies. Here's a couple of good examples of this. Right? If you're thinking about some of the high milopectin work that's being conducted both for maize and for potatoes, right? That's obviously being done by DuPont Pioneer, but it's being done in conjunction with the Swedish Agricultural Research Institute, which is an academic institute in Sweden, right? When you think about some of the non-browning work that's being done in some of the button mushroom, for example. This is essentially coming out of Yunong Yang's lab at Penn State, but it's being done in conjunction with what used to be Monsanto now. So there's a lot of translational work. There's a lot of stuff that actually goes in the ground that's being conducted as a pairing between academia and industry. On top of that, when it comes to agriculture, technology transfer is just a lot cheaper. Right? One of the reasons why it's a lot cheaper is you have a material, not just a concept, to transfer to industry. And essentially, this is the germplasm of the thing that you happen to be working on. You have a prototype for a waxy corn. You can actually transfer the germplasm to whoever your industry partner is. And rather than going through this rigmarole about patent licensing, you can sign a materials transfer agreement, which in some cases tends to be much easier than doing some of the exclusive patent licensing that universities do otherwise. Regulatory approval, we talked about this earlier, right? To get a new drug on the market, you need FDA approval. You must run clinical trials. And that is not always the case in the agriculture space. So if you're using genome editing technologies to knock out a particular gene, rather than inserting a gene from a different species, APHIS has essentially come out and said, yeah, you don't really need approval from us because you're not inserting a synthetic gene into the genome. We essentially don't have jurisdiction to review whatever you're doing. Go nuts, right? And so this is one of the reasons why I think we've seen such attraction when it comes to CRISPR for knocking out some certain genes that produce negative phenotypes. Right? On top of that, when it comes to agriculture, like the market is slightly more certain, at least in the industrial context, right? We can get a good sense about how in the industry space, a non-browning mushroom would do. To the extent we're only selling it to other granaries or crop feeders, we can get a certain sense about how good a waxy corn is going to do with a very high amylopectin content, right? Yeah, it's true. I definitely confess it remains uncertain for consumer crops, right? Unfortunately, much of the public remains skeptical over genetically modified crops. And I don't think the public is savvy enough to make a distinction between some of the methods that were used earlier and some of the more precise genome editing methods that we have now. But still, it's at least a little bit more certain than the gamble that is the human therapy space. When it comes to agriculture, I don't want to suggest that market competition isn't important, but market competition is important just in the sense that market competition is important in any other field. There's no expectation of franchising for any of the agriculture work that's going on. That is, if DuPont Pioneer comes out with a variant of waxy corn, there's really no expectation that Corteva is not going to come out with their own variant of waxy corn. That is, DuPont Pioneer doesn't necessarily have a sense that they're going to corner the waxy corn market. So this makes a lot of patent transfer issues, or some of the patent frictions that I've been talking about, a lot easier. And so unlike the human therapy space, where a lot of the solutions that we had for patent licensing weren't really that good, right? We have some good solutions in the agriculture space, right? So let's talk about pools, right? So do we have a major genome editing agriculture patent pool? No, we don't necessarily yet. But remember, the thing I mentioned earlier was that non-exclusivity was the big hang-up in the human therapy space. Well, non-exclusivity is not a huge problem in the agriculture space. So a pool very well may be attractive, right? We could also go with the clearinghouse model, right? This is where, everyone takes their patents, they give it to a third party, and the third party doles out who gets what, right? This is the model we have for CRISPR IP licensing in the agriculture space. DuPont Pioneer and the Broad Institute sublicenses from University of California and Corteva essentially now have a clearinghouse for CRISPR patent license for agricultural uses. On top of that, the Broad Institute has a robust licensing policy for who gets to use a lot of the patents that it has collected and not. There's been some intimation from some people that even though they have this clearinghouse, it's otherwise difficult to get a license for them. But it's at least true that some people are getting licenses, and it seems like the clearinghouse model is at least solving some of the problems that we were otherwise having in the human therapy space. On top of that, right, we have our consolidation model, right, where essentially, like, by having access to the patents, right, being able to dole out patent licenses, we can control not just the end product, right? It's not just, all right, well, here's a patent license, do whatever you want to do with it, right? But we can actually guide people through the development process step by step, from basic research to developing prototype to field trials to a commercial product at the very end. And this is a model at the very least that Two Blades is interested in. Two Blades, again, there's this nonprofit organization that has a bunch of patent licenses on TALENs and is really trying to develop agricultural applications using its TALENs technology. It views itself as essentially a soup to nuts funding shop from start to finish, right? Essentially using patent licenses as a way to mediate this, some of the research transfer. On top of that, right, we have a bunch of sub-licenses, right? We have, even though franchise competition in the human therapy space was bad, some of the bigger players in the field, namely DuPont Pioneer and Corteva, have been sub-licensing their technology out to other competitors to develop specific crop variants. So here's a couple of examples, right? Arcadia has a CRISPR patent license to develop some of its phenotypes in wheat. Syngenta, right, also has a CRISPR patent license for various crops out there. And Toolgen has a sub-license for agricultural platform development technologies that is not specific to a certain crop, but for ways of making some of the phenotype construct selection easier, right? Just a couple of more notes on this DuPont Pioneer clearinghouse model, right? So one of the interesting things I think about the DuPont Pioneer Broad Institute clearinghouse model is that the patent dispute that's currently raging between the University of California and the Broad Institute, because we've got this clearinghouse, it makes the stakes a lot less high, at least in the agricultural space, right? If everyone's going to get a patent license at the end of the day, either from the Broad Institute or the UC or both, it makes whoever the winner of that's going to be less important. It also makes Cas9 licensing way more convenient, right? Rather than having to go to a direct competitor with your hat in your hand, begging for a patent license, or having to deal with University Office of Technology Management, you have essentially a place who does nothing except dole out sublicenses. That just seems to make things slightly easier, right? In addition, by having this place where in theory it's easy to go to get a patent license, it's not just going to be like big established firms that are going to be doing this because they could pay money for lawyers to help them do this, right? It's going to allow small to medium crop engineering firms to go out and get the licenses they need to develop a commercial product, right? One other thing to note is that an interesting aspect of DuPont Pioneer and Broad Institute's patent license is they come with, quote, ethical restrictions, right? One of the ethical restrictions that is of particular importance in the crop space is that essentially DuPont Pioneer and the Broad Institute have forbidden the use of their patent licenses to anyone working using tobacco as a plant model, period. That is, you want to use CRISPR to develop, I don't know, a high nicotine or a low nicotine plant. You want to use tobacco as a model for, something for something else. You're not able to get a license from DuPont Pioneer or the Broad Institute to do that, right? They view this as an ethical restriction on their particular technology, right? So let me just sum all this up and just say that figuring out ways to engage in intellectual property licensing for agricultural technologies is incredibly important. And I think it's so important that the people on the human therapy side of stuff recognize this too. So at a recent National Academy of Medicine hearing last year, the bioethicist and law professor R. Alta Charo, when asked what the best use for some of these genome editing technologies were going to be, did not in fact point to the human therapy space, but pointed to the agricultural space as a way of benefiting all of humanity. And this is the quote that she said at this meeting, right? Most everyone here, right? Most everyone at this NAM meeting is interested in improving the lives of humans. And the best way of doing that is actually not in the human therapy space, but it's with gene editing through agricultural and environmental applications. So if you're working on agricultural applications using genome editing technologies, let me say that all of us here on the kind of human therapy side of the split very much applaud your efforts in figuring out best ways of engaging in some of the IP licensing to actually get a product in the ground and onto people's tables, right, is going to be incredibly important. All right, I think that concludes my 40 minutes here, and so we've got about 20 minutes for Q&A. And I don't know how the Q is usually conducted, but I mean, I'm happy to answer any questions anyone has about this or anything that's tangentially related to this.
Yes, I do.
Okay, so Giri, should I just call on people as they speak, or is there a queue, or what's the way things typically work?
Yeah. I mean, we can accept questions. Do you want the recording to be on for the questions, Jake?
Yeah, sure. I mean, with the caveat that if you're one of the people asking a question, that means you're going to be taped. But sure.
Yeah. So let's keep that in mind as we ask questions, and then. I think the best way to do it is either add them to chat or just ask them by yourself. If you're asking them by yourself, please state your name when you ask the question. Go ahead.
All right, so my name is Falasi Analechi. I have a couple of questions to ask from all the explanation you gave, Dr. Jacob. First, I want to find out, do you think that the patent holders are properly paid here in the US?
Do I think the patent holders are properly paid? And so by the holders, do you mean the universities and the...
I mean, those who have the patents, I mean,
look, inventors who receive royalties from some of these inventions, I mean, I would say are pretty well compensated. I mean, some of the people who run successful startups like they do pretty well for them. They do pretty well for themselves, right? So I mean, maybe it's helpful to like go through just like a little bit of hypothetical math, right? Let's say you've got a really amazing invention out there, right? And let's say that you're getting royalties from it, and you know, just to make the math easy, right? Let's say the royalties that ultimately come in are $1 million, right? Here at the University of Illinois, for example, the first thing that gets cut from that is whatever the university overhead is. And that tends to be pretty high, right? It tends to be about like 30%. All right, so we're gonna knock down 30%. That leaves us with, you know, 2/3 of $1 million. And that 2/3 of $1 million, then 40% goes to the actual, 40% goes to the actual inventors, right? So this is like $250,000 that go to whoever the PI and the grad students are that are listed on the patent. Another 40% goes back to the university's coffers, right? And 20% goes to the department that the PI works in. And so, you know, if you're working in, you know, I mean, if you're working in ABE or something like that, right? I mean, they're getting, you know, $125,000 from that. I mean, that's great compensation. It's a matter of figuring out it's a matter of figuring out a good industry partner to work with, and the hope that whatever invention you have is ultimately going to be successful. So, I mean, I do think that they can be well compensated.
Yeah, so that being the case, so the reason I'm asking is a lot of times you did mention about prevention, protective measures, and all of it. So since these patents, these inventions have already been patented over, and some kind of compensation being given. So why are there no little clauses that prevent these patent holders or the owners of these inventions from completely placing restrictions? Because I know, for instance, if someone does maybe an invention here in the States, maybe I may want to take it over in Africa and I want to have more applications to read. But then the patent holder says, no, I'm restricted. I can't do this. I can't do that. Then what's the use of the knowledge?
Sure. So let me start off by saying that patent lawyers like to say that patents are domestic creatures only, right? If I have a US patent, I can only enforce that patent within the boundaries of the United States. If I have a patent that's been issued by the European Patent Office, I can only enforce it within the boundaries of the countries that are signatories to the European Patent Convention. Me having a US patent, I have no rights to prevent anybody doing that same work in Africa. Now, mind you, if I have a South African patent, right, I can prevent people in South Africa from doing whatever they need to do. So much of the restrictions, rather than being, you know, from one country that are imposed on other countries, tend to be country specific, right? And so it's just simply going to depend on what the structure of the license is, right? There are a number of genome editing patent licenses that are specific to a particular country. And there's a big effort underway, especially when it comes to agricultural intellectual property license, to make those licenses cheaper or freely available to the agriculture industry in developing countries. So it's just going to entirely depend on what the patent holders say.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Oh, we have a question from Chelsea. All right, here I'm gonna read the question, just not knowing if everyone could see the chat box or not. Here's the question from Chelsea. Before this seminar, I thought that the UC Berkeley team had invented CRISPR. Can you tell us more about how the dispute between Berkeley and the Broad Institute came about, right? So this is a saga which at least I could fill many, many volumes on, right? But the kind of short answer is this, right? The UC Berkeley team comes up with essentially the first paper. This is the GenEc paper from 2012 that shows that you can use a single guide RNA CRISPR-Cas9 system in prokaryotes. The Broad Institute comes out with their paper in 2013, in early 2013. This is the Kong paper that essentially says, you know, two things. Thing number one, we got this to work in eukaryotic cells. Thing number two, we got this to work in a multiplex system. That is, we can feed it a bunch of guide RNAs at the same time and edit a bunch of genes at the same time, right? Later, it's found out that the University of California applied for patents basically only covering the prokaryotic system, only covering bacteria, and that the Broad Institute team applied for patents specifically on eukaryotic cells, so animals, plants. There was a dispute at the patent office, right, as to, you know, essentially who was the first to invent quote unquote CRISPR, with a question mark hanging over, you know, what does it mean when you say invented CRISPR? Is it for all systems? Is it just for bacteria? Is it for just for eukarya? We want to know. And so that's the kind of basic contours of the dispute that we have and are still having now. But I mean, this kind of issue as to who was the first to invent, at least for eukaryotic systems, remains to be particularly important to both parties, because needless to say, it's the eukaryotic systems where kind of all of the money is at. So that's the general contours. If you're curious about more, there's a lot that's been written on it. I keep all my CRISPR patent papers on SSRN. If you just Google my name and SSRN, all my CRISPR patent interference papers are out there, and some of them try to explain this as much as possible to non-lawyer audiences. So hopefully maybe some of that is helpful. Do we have other questions from anyone? Here, why don't we take this question from Caleb first, and then we'll move on to the next question we have in the chat.
Sorry about that. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm just interested in the second interference decision that you had mentioned came today.
Yeah, would it be helpful to just briefly explain what happened, or?
Yeah.
Sure. Okay. So there's this type of procedure at the patent office called an interference case. And an interference case is essentially, and I'm kind of oversimplifying here, but it's when two inventors essentially come to the patent office at the same time, and there's an issue over who was the first to invent that particular piece of technology. In order to decide that question, you have to decide what the what is. You have to decide like what the invention you're fighting over is. And so in the first interference, the decision was made that the dispute was going to center over this prokaryotic or eukaryotic divide that I mentioned earlier. So the question was, who was the first to invent eukaryotic applications of CRISPR-Cas9? And if that's the question, do we need to have an interference in the first place? And the first interference, the patent office said, seems like the Broad Institute was the first, Zhang and the Broad Institute, they were the first to invent eukaryotic applications of CRISPR-Cas9. And there's not enough in UC's application to tell us exactly how eukaryotic applications work. So we don't even need to have like a real deal interference trial, right? And everyone just kind of go their separate ways. Broad Institute gets the eukaryotic stuff. UC gets the prokaryotic stuff. UC then engaged in some, I'm trying to, trying to not use the legal terminology, like engaged in some wrangling with the patent office, and somehow still got their patent application approved by the patent office that included both eukaryotic and prokaryotic applications. And so this outfit at the patent office called the Patent Trial and Appeal Board said, wait a second, not so fast. This is kind of counter to what we said earlier. So let's have a second interference now about who was the first to invent the single guide RNA system as opposed to the dual guide RNA system, right? And so that was a decision that just came out today. It was whether this was like the proper way of thinking about things. It is whether or not we're really going to have a fight over single guide RNA or dual guide RNA. The answer is we are. And the other answer is, all right, well, if it's this, like, what's the earliest invention date that everybody has? And the short story there is that it seems like the Broad Institute, believe it or not, at least according to the Patent Office, substantially has the earlier dates. More specifically, that they're entitled to at least a date of December 12th, 2012, and they may even have a date as early as March of 2011, which is way before I think anybody thought that they were working on this. And so I think the story about who really invented CRISPR has not completely been told yet, and may actually end up being told at the Patent Office. This happens sometimes, but that's the way that these things happen. So that was the second interference decision that came out today. I'm going to move on then. Oh, was that good? Unless you have a quick follow-up.
Yes. No. Yep. Thank you. That answered my question. Thank you.
I'm going to move on to the other question that's in the chat right now from Annie. Here's what Annie says. Are patents in the human therapy space treated differently in other countries? I believe that you mentioned that drug companies in the US are able to charge high prices due to the super competitive prices, right? So are they treated differently in other countries? Yes and no, right? So there are different standards for the types of drugs and human therapies you could get patent coverage for elsewhere, right? The rules in the United States are not the same as the patent rules in Europe or in India, right? But patents everywhere have the effect of allowing patent holders to charge supra-competitive prices. So in that sense, it's no different from the way things happen in the United States versus, let's say, Europe. Now, mind you, the healthcare system in the United States, the way that we purchase drugs, is incredibly different from, frankly, anywhere else on the face of the earth. And I mean that as an insult, not as a compliment, right? And so by virtue of that, patents have much more sway over drug prices in the United States, because we essentially only have not only, but we have mostly have a system of private payers or public payers who don't do a great job negotiating for drug prices because either they can't or they're hemmed in by certain laws, right? Versus other countries' healthcare systems that say, all right, fine, you've got a patent and you want to set your super competitive price, that's fine. But if it's too high, we, the National Health Services, just to use the United Kingdom as an example, are just not going to pay you, right? And so by virtue of that, there's more room for negotiation as what those prices are outside of the United States versus inside the United States. Hopefully that makes sense. I don't know. Hopefully that answered your question.
I have a question.
Yeah, sure. Girish, tell me.
So this is something I guess we've talked offline about, but I just was wondering what your thoughts are overall on how the vaccine for COVID-19 is going to play out, the IP, and how it will be brought to people, and what are some, just as somebody in this field, what are your thoughts?
Great question. So first things first, I can't help but say, I've written a lot about this recently. And so if you are curious, there's a blog that I and 3 other co-authors have been writing about all this patent policy for COVID stuff on. The name of the blog is Written Description, which is like a patent, I don't know, pun or term or something like that. I'm going to post the link in the chat for everybody if you want to come and read this stuff. Here's the short answer about the COVID vaccine, right? So generally speaking, like I said earlier to Annie's question, right? Like patent, because we don't do a good job at negotiating prices for healthcare technologies in the United States, patents have this outsized effect on what prices are going to be. It's like kind of the opposite for COVID though. And then we got 2 things that are happening in the COVID space. Thing number 1, we have what are called advanced market commitments. That is, the government, before any vaccine has been created, has already committed essentially $2 billion for every 100 million doses to companies making a vaccine out there, period, right? Because of these advanced market commitments, the market is certain. And so if you got a patent and the patent's only gonna let you like set the price this much higher than marginal cost, but the advanced market commitment's already up here, the patents don't do you any work. Like they don't add anything to this. So that like the patents aren't gonna have an outsized effect on what the market's gonna be. The government has set what the market's going to be already. The second reason is that, where I said before, patents are really important for franchising. There is no rational expectation in franchising here. That is, the first company to develop a COVID vaccine, let me assure you, is not gonna politically be able to say, all right, and anyone who creates a COVID vaccine, you have to stay off the market, we're the only player in town. There's no government, regardless of who gets elected in November, there is no government that's gonna allow that to happen. So because there's no expectation of franchising, it's almost like the whole point of having a patent in the human therapy space is like kind of pointless.
Yeah.
If anything, like the thing that you want is like you want to bump up what your AMC, what your advanced market commitment is going to be. So if they used to say, all right, we'll give you $2 billion for 100 million doses, maybe you want to go to them and be like, I don't know, we got a pretty good vaccine. It's better than these other guys' vaccine. We want 2.2, we want 2.5. And that's just not a patent calculus, right? That's just like
so that's a good thing,
garden
right? In some way.
variety negotiation. Sorry?
So you feel that that's a good thing, right? Like, I mean, people are not going to worry about patenting and just get the vaccines out.
Let's say for a moment, and this is somewhat of a crazy way of thinking about it because it's probably not going to actually happen, but let's just say for a moment that every single company that has an advanced market commitment on their vaccine is successful in developing a vaccine and actually gets paid the AMC that they're promised. Like, let's just say everything works on paper, everything works out the way it's written down on paper right now. If that is true, that's actually going to happen, right? That means that we will make COVID go away in America for between $6 billion and $8 billion.
Okay.
That's amazing. Here's how amazing that is. The top selling drug in the United States right now is this one monoclonal antibody called Humira. Humira generates $20 billion a year in revenue.
Wow.
Right? Here's a drug that you probably haven't heard of, you probably don't take. It nets $20 billion per year to treat a couple 100,000 people, right? We're going to make COVID go away for 350 million people for $8 billion. That's cheap. That's amazing, right? That is half the revenue that the NFL generates each season and probably about what it is now. I think that's worth it. That's incredible. Yeah. So let's see what actually happens. But yeah, I do think that in certain contexts, the advanced market commitments could be worth it. This is probably such a context.
Yeah. Very cool. All right, so we're on the hour. I'm going to stop the recording.